design as we know it now was not, was not really a thing when iPhone was launched. It was just this massive case study for the value and the power of design. And so Ginny Rometty steps into the role of CEO at IBM and looking around and seeing Apple just going to the moon with their business success and seeing the competition like passing IBM by or about to, it didn't take a whole lot of imagination at that moment to see that, that company was stuck and they needed to start doing some things differently in order to be relevant. Designers envision a better future. That's the core. My responsibility was bringing those new designers into the company. At IBM, we actually added over 3,000 designers to the company in my time there. Just unthinkable numbers, really, based on how design had been practiced previously. There were no designers in executive roles in that company. We had to build all of that, and other companies were building all of that at the same time. If you're reporting to a CEO, you are absolutely beholden to them. And it's definitely one of those be careful what you wish for examples.
Welcome to Product Craft, Doug.
Yeah, thank you, Arseny.
You're an award-winning design leader who's had a tremendous impact on how organizations approach design. You helped drive IBM's design transformation, growing their design practice to, I believe, over 1,000 designers across 30 plus studios worldwide. And then you later joined Expedia as VP of design. And now you're focused on coaching and teaching the next generation of design leaders through your podcast, This is a Prototype, and your course, Design Leadership at Scale. When I started this podcast, I wanted to talk with people who have dedicated their lives to the craft of making products in a broad sense. And with each conversation, my understanding of craft continues to evolve. I think it's going to be a really useful episode for those who are just starting in their careers and more seasoned designers who are looking for their next step. To kick us off, I wanted to ask you, who or what inspired you to be a designer?
Well, I was, thank you. Thanks for that introduction and thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation. When I was a child, I was the kid who could draw. I could draw well. And that was sort of one of the things that defined me as I was growing up. And I really enjoyed it. I still do. I still love making pictures in different ways. But as I grew up, I really just wanted to do that. And I wanted to find a way to do that as a career if I could. And there aren't too many ways to do that. And there certainly weren't when I was growing up. There wasn't an obvious path forward for that skill set.
Yeah.
Design as we know it now was not really a thing. But graphic design had emerged as a growing field. This was in the kind of the 70s and 80s, and then so that was sort of kind of came onto my radar as I was going through high school and thinking about, all right, what's the future? And I went to university and studied visual communications and came out as a graphic designer and illustrator. And this was a time in the late 80s, early 90s when everything was done analog. This is just before the Mac, the early Mac workstations were really sort of prominent and prevalent in design studios. Mm-hmm. So I learned all of that. I learned, speaking of craft, I learned how to make design and how to do design in a very sort of hands-on analog world and practice.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you made money with design?
Yes. I do. I used to get asked, again, because I was the guy who could draw pictures, mm-hmm. I would get asked by different groups, like school groups or teams, or to do the theater posters or the volleyball T-shirts or the yearbook cover, when mm-hmm. I was in school. And occasionally, I mean, almost all of that was volunteer, but occasionally I would get maybe, 10 or 15, $20 for doing for doing an illustration or a graphic that would be on a whatever, a t-shirt. And so yeah, not a lot of money, and it certainly wasn't the point at the time, but
Hmm.
that was probably it. When I was in university, I worked at the university student newspaper, and that was probably the first sort of steady job, paying job as a designer, and doing, paste up and keynotes
Hmm.
or key lines and setting type on an old, typesetting machine. And yeah,
Yeah.
it was a whole different way of doing things back then, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I definitely want to tap into that soon about how the industry has changed. Sometimes when I talk to my friends who are, a lot of them are excellent designers, it's interesting that a recurring theme that I hear is that people say that they seem to be tired of design. Some people lose their passion and the initial drive. Some kind of continue to do it, because they need to make money. Some find new hobbies that they feel more excited about. I'm curious, how do you feel about what you do these days? How do you feel about design?
Yeah, I think that's fair what you're describing. I think it's I certainly see that. I've certainly felt that, myself as a designer throughout my career at different points, where it feels like I'm not learning anything anymore. This isn't interesting. This feels like I'm just kind of cranking it out. And I mean, if you look at my career path, it's hardly even a path. It's just twists and turns and pivots and zigzags. It's almost comical in how many times, I've turned. And I think that basically comes to what you're describing, these moments where it's like, this just isn't interesting, and something else is more interesting, and
Hmm.
I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go explore that. I'm going to get curious about this new thing, whether it's a new piece of technology. Very early in my career, just after coming out of university, there was the Mac, and then, that obviously changed everything. A few years later, there was the internet, and then there was mobile technology, and then there were all of the practices that came, along with that: UX design, design research, human centered design, really kind of taking root. All of these things.
After 30 years or so, right, in the career, I mean, do you feel excitement still? And if yes,
Oh
what
yeah.
do you feel excited about?
Yeah, I mean, we're in just a massive moment of change right now. I mean, the technology that's emerging, AI, virtual reality, even like blockchain, the continued sort of evolution of mobile technology and devices. And I mean, it's just a wild, wild time right now, with all sorts of. I mean, it's like when I was earlier in my career, those examples that I gave you, those were like the single, like, obvious things that you wanted to point yourself toward. Now it's like we've got 100 things that we could point ourselves toward. I'm excited about what's next for design. I think it's really, for me, what is next? What's the future? And it is yet to be written. I mean,
Yeah.
there is nobody, anyone who tells you they've got the answer to that, no way. I mean, it's
How do
going to be
you
different very soon.
Yeah, how do you make sense of what's going on? Like, I mean, I also, as you mentioned, like, I personally find it, mm, like, at times overwhelming. I think a lot of people probably also feel like FOMO, all the tools, like just, I think just a couple of months ago when I was starting this podcast, I was talking to some folks and like, well, have you tried any tools for design and AI? And the response was like, well, yeah, I tried, but it was like very mediocre, kind of far out. And actually, and right now I'm like every day on LinkedIn, I'm seeing new startup. like that is specifically, design, prompt-based AI integration with code, like, and there's, I don't even know how many, there's a lot. How do you have a way to keeping up with news and developments, or how do you make sense of it all?
I think that I mean I feel the same thing. I mean to be honest, I feel like you could be reading, listening, watching just 24 hours a day and still feel like you're behind,
Yeah.
the knowledge because it's changing so much and there's so much of it. So I do that as much as I can and as much as I can absorb, reading what's out there, trying to seek it out rather than having it fed to me, which, that's always challenging as a fine line. But then also really tapping into my network. I always find that I learn best from conversations and from people who I trust. And so that's just really you were talking a moment ago about the course that I'm teaching for design leaders, and I invite people from my network to come in and talk, to speak with the classes. And that's a great way to getting those people from my network to come in and share their wisdom. And
Yeah.
it's like, oh yeah, okay, that's a great way for me to learn. I find that teaching is actually a great way to learn, to
Yeah.
be honest, like because I have to understand something, develop a point of view about it, and then kind of craft it into something that I can deliver to others, and so that they can consume it and they can learn from it.
Are there some maybe top of mind companies that you've noticed or initiatives that you are keeping like a closer look at, as part of this new transformation right now that's happening in the product development community?
I live in Austin, Texas, which is the home of South by Southwest, the big tech and design conference, and it
Mhm.
happens to be happening right now here in Austin. And yesterday, I had a chance to go spend some time with John Maeda, who is a legendary thought leader and leader of design and academia, and always at the front edge of technology. John does a great job of kind of taking it's easy to be overwhelmed by where we are. We were talking about that a moment ago. And he just really kind of brings it back to what it really is, which is a
Mhm.
piece of technology. He was saying, look, the AI is basically a spreadsheet. AI is basically, a bunch of code, and don't get overwhelmed by it. It's something that we can work with. It's a tool and it's a resource for us. And I thought that was really refreshing.
As you mentioned, nobody knows where the future is headed. There is a direction at the moment that feels to be that the product development as a whole is going to be sort of streamlined, and more people are going to be able to take part in it. Like it's going to be easier to create and execute sort of standard routine mundane things, like creating a button, connecting that button to another button is going to be able to be possible with kind of a couple of prompts. You can run and deploy, your app right away with a few clicks. So there is this whole potential blend of roles that is happening right now. And I think a lot of designers, and I think probably not only designers, are thinking about like, well, what's going to happen, to my role? How do we are designers now going to be doing engineering tasks? Are product managers going to be doing design? Like, what is your take on this potential blend, and maybe how do we stay grounded in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of that concern. What is my job going to be? How will it change? Will I have a job? And the answer. I mean, I look at a couple of things. First, I look at history, and the history that I've lived through my career of several decades of going through these cycles of new technology that has caused a lot of concern and a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety at each of these points: the Mac, the internet, mobile technology, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're at another one of those points, but the anxiety and the fear has been the same throughout. And what we've seen in each of those moments up until now is not a contraction of design, but an expansion of design. I think that is where what the eventual outcome of this transformative moment will be. I don't think it's going to be like it doesn't happen right away. There is perhaps, and we're seeing this in the industry, an initial reaction of contraction, right? An initial reaction that no, we've got to close down. We've got to sort of get as lean as we can. And then I think as the new roles, as the new ways of working begin to get codified and begin to emerge and begin to the path forward begins to sort of clarify for us, then I think we'll see an expansion, and I think it'll be a powerful one. Now, the important thing also with all of those transformative moments is that designers needed to reskill and relearn and develop themselves and advance their understanding of those new ways of working. If you don't do that, then you'll be left behind. So, to that designer who is thinking, what's my job going to be in 6 months, a year, 2 years? You need to grab the steering wheel and you need to begin to understand this technology. You need to get your hands on it. You need to start working with it, playing with it, creating with it. And that's what's going to make you relevant.
Yeah, I resonate with that. Is instead of being afraid, actually learning and embracing it and seeing how it can be applied, and almost like if designers take charge and start to utilize it and show the rest of the organization what is now possible. Like, I think it's opening some really exciting opportunities. Just the other day I was thinking that we create Figma prototypes, obviously, that no that's not news for anyone, but why not start create like functional prototypes potentially to be able to envision and then test parts of the experience, instead of having to wait maybe until resources are available. Yeah, so like I think, yeah, more opportunities are opening up for sure, but it is hard to keep track of everything that's going on, like literally every day.
Right. Right. Yeah, and it's going to impact not only the products we design, but also the way we design them. So it's impacting the output and it's impacting the workflow.
Can you double click on that, like how we design, meaning what?
Well, I mean, our practice as designers it's already being impacted and changing by AI, and it will continue to do so. I mean, you look at prototyping, as you said. I mean, being able to, just truly rapid prototype in a way that we could never imagine before, at a high fidelity. Ideation, divergent thinking, which has always been a challenging sort of moment in the cycle of human centered design. When we get to that point where we've learned everything we can learn and we've got our point of view, and we've then we need to come up with 10 or 20 or 100 new ideas, and now we've got a new way to do that. And then synthesis, especially
Mhm.
of research findings, that if you've previously, if you've done great research, great user research, you could find yourself with a literal wall of of statements that you've collected from users, and that process of manually synthesizing all of that data is a seriously time consuming thing. Now that is something that AI does extremely well and extremely quickly. So we're seeing all of these moments that have been just sort of naturally required to take a certain amount of time and resources and effort in the design cycle and the design workflow. And, now we see them compressing. And so that's an area where if you're a designer thinking, all right, what's an area that I can really kind of get into here and get good at, look at that. Look at the design workflow and just pick a point in there that you already have some expertise about, and just go in and explore how it's going to change using and get really good and really knowledgeable about that thing. And you're going to be valuable. You're going to be super valuable.
Yeah, that's a great advice. Considering like how things may evolve and how things may change based on what we just talked about, what is the core that you would say designers do? What is it about?
Yeah. Designers envision a better future. That's the core. That's the single truth. And then we express that future, and we create that future in many different ways. We create digital experiences on mobile devices that are better than that make it easier and better for the user of that device to do whatever they're trying to do. We create better um, physical spaces, buildings. We create better urban spaces, urban design. We create better, clothing, more comfortable, more functional, more, attractive, whatever it is. We create better brands for businesses and other organizations. So the expression of it can happen in many different ways, but the core idea is we are envisioning a better future.
Yeah, I personally resonate with that. That's actually interesting because I've talked to several designers, like asked a similar question, and the response, like there is definitely an overlap in that, it is about envisioning the future, helping to, bridge the path, helping to define that path from the current, state of reality to the desired state of reality. But what would you say to someone that, well, I can go to Midjourney or any other app and I can type in, create a futuristic building, right? Is that the act of design? Does that make the person a designer? And what is the difference there?
I that doesn't sound like it makes the person a designer. I don't know. I'm not familiar with that particular app, but it sounds like that is not about envisioning a better future. That's about creating a thing. And sure, the creating of the thing is part of the broader process, but it's really like, what does the thing need to do? Who are the people who use the thing? What are they struggling with? What do we know about them? How can we make their experience, their life, their work better, easier, faster, more efficient, more delightful?
Yeah.
Those are the important questions. It's not, and then once we understand all of that, then yes, we can say, with all of those inputs, we can then say, okay, make a modern building, or make a piece of clothing that fits all of these requirements. But until we understand all of that, then we're just sort of arbitrarily making something.
Yeah. Midjourney, it's just a generative AI thing. It can just generate images. But another stupid question. What
That
what
wasn't a stupid question.
what would be the difference then with a product manager? product managers are responsible for, understanding the pain points of customers and defining, the way forward on how to shape the product. Like what is unique then about what designers contribute?
Uh, yeah, I mean, product manager is going to have some of that, but they've also got a vast other responsibilities. They are essentially the CEO of the product, so they need to, a product manager, if they're doing their job, they also need to be paying attention to the finances and economics of the product. They need to be examining the competitive landscape and how the product is going to market. And there are many other sort of aspects of and responsibilities of a product manager. So a good product manager will have certainly an appreciation for design and the value of design and the power of design, and will surround themselves with a strong design team and strong design leadership, who can really create a transformative experience. And if they're able to, even better, if they're able to participate in a really engaged way in the critique of design. Some of the great product managers are also great critiquers, and they understand how to deliver feedback. They understand how to analyze design and see what's strong and what's not, and how to, and then we express that future and we create that future in many different ways. We create digital experiences on mobile devices that are better than that make it easier and better for the user of that device to do whatever they're trying to do. We create better physical spaces, buildings. We create better urban spaces, urban design. We create better, clothing, more comfortable, more functional, more, attractive, whatever it is. We create better brands for businesses and other organizations. So the expression of it can happen in many different ways, but the core idea is we are envisioning a better future.
What would you say to someone that, well, I can go to Midjourney or any other app and I can type in create a futuristic building? Is that the act of design? Does that make the person a designer? And what is the difference there?
That doesn't sound like it makes the person a designer. I'm not familiar with that particular app, but it sounds like that is not about envisioning a better future. That's about creating a thing. And sure, the creating of the thing is a part of the broader process, but it's really like, what does the thing need to do? Who are the people who use the thing? What are they struggling with? What do we know about them? How can we make their experience, their life, their work better, easier, faster, more efficient, more delightful?
Yeah.
Those are the important questions. And then once we understand all of that, then yes, we can say, with all of those inputs, we can then say, okay, make a modern building, or make a piece of clothing that fits all of these requirements. But until we understand all of that, then we're just sort of arbitrarily making something.
Another stupid question.
That wasn't a stupid question.
What would be the difference then with a product manager? Product managers are responsible for, understanding the pain points of customers and defining the way forward on how to shape the product. Like what is unique then about what designers contribute?
Yeah, I mean, product manager is going to have some of that, but they've also got a vast other responsibilities. They are essentially the CEO of the product, so they need to, a product manager, if they're doing their job, they also need to be paying attention to the finances and economics of the product. They need to be examining the competitive landscape and how the product is going to market. There are many other sort of aspects of and responsibilities of a product manager. So a good product manager will have certainly an appreciation for design and the value of design and the power of design, and will surround themselves with a strong design team and strong design leadership who can really create a transformative experience. And if they're able to, even better, if they're able to participate in a really engaged way in the critique of design. Some of the great product managers are also great critiquers, and they understand how to deliver feedback. They understand how to analyze design and see what's strong and what's not, and how to get designers to be better.
Yeah, but I mean, to some extent, designers should also explore, competitive landscape and understand why they're doing it. And probably, a leader, head of design or director of design should be able to provide critique as well, right? I'm kind of trying to, I know it's maybe hard to define. I'm trying to find and pinpoint maybe some of those distinctions because there is sometimes, I feel like, especially now when more people can do the execution part, the fundamental question is, like what are the skills of designers that make them uniquely valuable in the organization that perhaps others are not as well positioned to deliver?
I think the depth of our abilities to craft excellent outputs, and understand when you're seeing a well-crafted experience versus one that's not. And that's one of the things in the moment we're in right now, where it's so easy to create a relatively high fidelity prototype, and a good designer and good design leader will be able to go in and say, yeah, okay, on the surface that looks good, but here are 10 areas where this needs to get better. And it could be down to the kerning of the typography. It could be down to the use of color. It could be down to aspects of accessibility, also in the realm of a good designer, good design team. And those are not, if you're even a good product manager who has a good eye for design, a good appreciation for design, it is very, very rare that they are going to have that level of attention to detail of craft.
What you described is the passion that designers have for creating better experiences, essentially. Now, the question is how to amplify the voice of designers so that those UX quality of life improvements are actually being implemented and manifested in the product. I'm sure that a lot of designers struggle with well, we can improve this, we can improve that. Why is it not happening? It's so obvious, but there is other priorities. There is, lack of resources. So what would be some of the tips that you may have for helping designers to advocate for those quality and experience improvements that may not be top of mind for everybody else?
Yeah, I think you're right. Obviously, in the reality of a complex product organization, it's very challenging. In fact, I was talking about John Maeda a moment ago, and a talk that I saw him deliver. It was actually just sort of an AMA kind of conversation, but he made a comment that that really stuck with me, which was anytime you've got more than three people creating a product, it gets really complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just an obvious thing, but it's like, yes, absolutely, because we've got priorities, we've got time, time constraints, we've got all sorts of forces at play that the designer, in many cases, has very little control over. And what we need to be doing is, first of all, understanding that it can oftentimes be a long game. It's a marathon. There's an aspect of resiliency that's needed to just kind of repeatedly deliver our point of view. And it may be that 9 times it just seems like it's fallen on deaf ears, but then the 10th time you can make your point. And that repetition and that resiliency that can be maddening, because it can seem like there's no way they're hearing me. There's no way that this is moving the needle. But it's absolutely a requirement. It's actually one of the core principles of the design leadership course that I teach is repetition, repetition, repetition.
Mm-hmm.
And constantly delivering that message of value of design, of what design is and why it's valuable, and then giving those very detailed examples of why this choice that you're making right now to diminish the user experience. And then you put it out there, and then you say, we're going to make a decision about this, a business decision that's going to involve a bunch of different points of view, but the point of view of design is, if we don't fix this, it's going to make the experience worse.
And how do you then make that connection between the importance of experience on the bottom line of the company? Like, what are some of the core metrics that a designer should keep in mind and be like, well, I need to frame my proposal in those terms from that particular angle, because then I will maximize being heard.
First of all, whenever we're thinking about the metrics that we're using to document this and to have this conversation, essentially, we need to be, as often as possible, identifying metrics that resonate with our cross-functional
Mm-hmm.
peers and stakeholders. So if we're coming up with something that is purely whatever it is, an aesthetic, sort of way of measuring something, a product manager doesn't that's not very compelling to them.
Mm-hmm.
But if we can say part of what we need to do here with this product is people need to be able to learn how to use this product in order for us to meet the business objectives that we're all striving for. And so what do they need to do in order to learn this product? Well, they need to be able to go through a sequence of tutorials or steps or tasks. They need to complete a set of tasks. They need to get familiar with the digital environment that we've created for them. Say, for instance, the business is saying, well, we can't make this whole sequence of onboarding as consistent as you want it to be, design leader, because we need to ship. And then that design leader can say, hey, that's okay, we can ship, but you need to understand the risk here, and you need to understand that we are not going to be able to deliver on this experience at the highest level unless we make this a great experience, unless we make it a consistent experience, unless we make it a delightful experience. All of these things that we as designers are great at. And then when we talk in the language of risk, what are the risks to the business? then that's something where most product managers are going to, that's a language that they are very familiar with. And if you can point out in a compelling way that there's a potential to damage the business that you are trying to build if we don't do this right.
So essentially translating design improvements to business impact and risk of what may happen if we don't act on this. Less about I like because this is beautiful, and more about if we don't do this, we risk XYZ, or if we do this, it's going to help us, improve this particular workflow or.
Right. At this point, I think most product managers, I'll kind of put that in air quotes, perhaps, are recognize that design is not a subjective things, that those aesthetic choices are not, well, I don't like the color green, so we can't use, I don't want to see green anywhere in this. I mean, that's the, anytime you hear really sort of subjective comments like that from a non-design stakeholder who has influence in the process, you need to have probably a separate conversation with them about how they're showing up.
You meet with hundreds of designers or tens of designers as part of the course, like on a regular basis. What do designers tend to not realize about how the world works that they should be acknowledging and realizing? Like, what are some of the just gaps in designers' understanding about how the world operates?
Yeah, I think there's one very fundamental one that I see as a clear pattern, and that is that designers who have moved through their career from the early sort of hands-on making of design early in their career to leading a project or a team to becoming a manager, perhaps having more responsibility for how a team or a set of teams are operating. They get really good at that, right? As they're moving up in through their career into these new roles, and then oftentimes suddenly, oftentimes without, oftentimes surprisingly, the game changes because they're suddenly expected to have impact on the business beyond that team or those set of teams that they've been responsible for and that they've grown and that they've nurtured and whose performance they've elevated. Now they're expected to have impact with their cross-functional horizontal peers and other parts of the business that they don't have a lot of connection with. And that's a natural evolution that happens when you get to a certain point in your career. So the problem is that nobody ever talks about that. And so as I meet with design leaders at that point in their career, that sort of mid-career, point, maybe they're moving into a design director role or something of that nature. Titles are different in different companies, but generally speaking, a design manager. And they're just suddenly they've been a high performer and they've really done great things, as a designer and lead and manager over different roles, and now all of a sudden they're struggling and they don't know the vocabulary of how to go out there and navigate the rest of the business. They've gotten so good at that functional subordinate team that they have been responsible for, that they just haven't developed the skills to go out in the rest of the business and operate. And so that's what I do with my courses and with my coaching clients. So we talk a lot about just what are the behaviors, what's the vocabulary, what are some of the artifacts that can help you, achieve that? What are some of the tactical ways to actually go out there and build trust with key people out in the business?
Yeah, that is, I think, the word vocabulary, that's the important one. I think kind of closing the gap between those different mental models, almost between a designer and, I don't know, executives or other commercial officer. A designer should be able to communicate to their cross-functional counterparts and kind of talk their language, right?
Yep. Yep. Absolutely.
So design leadership is it's a big theme for you. You have a course, you coach, you mentor. So you were able to describe what design is kind of as this way to envisioning the future. How would you sum up what design leadership is?
Well, I think it's important for us to just briefly remember where we are in the history of design. In the last 12 to 15 years, we've just seen a exponential growth in the field as a result of the explosion of digital technology and everything that's gone with it, and the need to create great user experiences that are part of those digital experiences, that digital technology. So we've seen, big tech companies across the board, just incredible growth in teams and programs and the investment that companies are making in design. And with that, as these programs have grown, and as you were talking earlier about my background at IBM and Expedia. At IBM, you mentioned 1,000 designers. We actually added over
Wow.
3,000 designers to the company in my time there, in almost 9 years. So, I mean, just just unthinkable numbers, really, based on how design had been practiced previously. So, with that has come the need then for organizing those designers in a fairly sophisticated way, and that has then resulted in all of these very new tiers of management and leadership, all the way from a design lead, a manager, a senior manager, director, up to a VP or even higher, a chief design officer. All of those titles that I just mentioned, by and large, did not exist 15 years ago. Certainly 15 years ago, 12 years ago, and 13. I was just joining IBM, and we were just kicking off that program. There was no VP of design at IBM. There were no designers in executive roles in that company. We had to build all of that, and other companies were building all of that at the same time. The entire industry was building that infrastructure. So, all of that to say, these roles are brand new. In most cases, we're talking about a 10-year time frame here, when the whole idea of design leadership in scaled organizations has materialized. And so what that means is that virtually everyone who is now in a position of leadership as a designer has had to learn that they haven't learned that the way we learn other things, by going to, university, or going to some educational program, or getting a certificate, or whatever it is. They've had to they've had to learn it on the go. They've had to learn it as they've gone along. That's what we're dealing with right now. Now, 10 years from now, and in 10 years into the future, another generation of leaders will come through, and we'll have a bit of a playbook, a bit of a template, because of the people who are in leadership roles right now, kind of paving the way, creating a path. But right now, we're still in that first wave of designers becoming leaders, and having to make it up, having to just create the whole idea by themselves.
Yeah, you just touched on so many interesting things. Like one thing that made me realize is it's a very interesting perspective that you mentioned, that those are actually new roles, like relatively speaking, 10, 12 years ago. And this frequent example, people say that although it feels like we live in a not such a great world, full of wars and bad stuff happening, if you look at historically, we're actually at a time where people are actually better off in general. So I guess it almost made me think that, like, in that context, like, designers may feel that not heard enough, the voice is not amplified, blah, blah, blah. But in the big scheme of things, actually, we may be doing a lot better. Yeah. And it's actually a very interesting topic. Yeah. I haven't thought about it this way.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned my role before. I was at IBM. I was national president of AIGA in the U.S. That which at the time was the most prominent design association in the U.S. And in that role, I had the chance to visit designers all over the country and different cities and different communities, and to see how they were working. So that was 2011 to 2013. So that was just before I joined IBM, just before this big, sort of explosion of design in, in the tech world and in bigger companies. And it was a very interesting time because none of these big corporate programs, design programs existed then. I mean, a few outliers were starting to happen, but by and large, designers were working either as independent practitioners, or they were working in small studios, small agencies, small teams in companies. So, there were certainly designers working in bigger businesses, but they were always at the very edge of the business. In these small teams, very tactically oriented. They didn't, they weren't involved in any sort of strategic conversations. They weren't talking about product management, and they weren't really, they didn't have a seat at the table, which is a well-worn metaphor, but no seat at the table. Didn't even know where the table was, you know just couldn't even dream of getting in that room. But boy, they wanted to do more, and virtually every designer that I interacted with in those years was just hungry to have more impact. They were just they felt like they had so much more to offer than they were given the chance to do in that previous sort of world order. Yeah, and so then it really started to happen in those subsequent years, which is
Yeah.
kind of a fascinating turning of the page historically.
You mentioned that in your time, you were able to scale design organization at IBM to 3,000 plus designers. What prompted this realization that it is an important program, and sort of what was this green light for you and probably your core team to say, okay, let's go, there is the support of the business, let's do this?
Yeah. It wouldn't have happened without the CEO of the company. Ginny Rometty was the CEO. She had just taken that role, and I think at the end of 2011. So it was within, plus or minus within about a year of her being appointed CEO. 2011, 2012, 2013, those years were when this mission and this investment in creating, really investing in design as a prioritized capacity within that company. So think about those years and what was happening in those years, and what happened a few years before that, namely in 2007. That was a total pivot point for this whole story, which is when iPhone was launched. And that then suddenly became, obviously, not just a business transformative business story, but just a cultural story, like a pivot point in just about everything: the business, the technology, the culture, all of the practices around all of that. It was just this massive, and still is, this massive case study for the value of and the power of design. And so Ginny Rometty steps into the role of CEO at IBM in 2011, 2012, as were many of her peers in other companies, other CEOs, and looking around and seeing Apple just going to the moon with their business success. And she's looking around IBM at the time like, I, I, how, I mean, we are not positioned to do anything close to that. How are we going to do that? And part of the answer to that, not the entire answer, but part of the answer was you need more design. You need more designers. You need to build practices of design. You need to build design workspaces for designers and their stakeholders to work together, collaborate together. You need to hire a lot of designers, and you need to kind of create a whole sort of infrastructure and culture for those designers to come into. So that was really the context
Mm-hmm.
for what then became, a pretty substantial initial investment in to kind of jumpstart that design program starting in
Yeah,
2013.
that's fascinating. Would you say that also it sort of shed the light that a device with a like superior user experience kind of highlighted the importance and what design can play to the success of the business, besides it being a platform that you can create a lot of applications on, etc., but also like, wow, this is a great case study for success of design.
Yeah, I think it did, and there was an aspirational aspect of it. Like we need to make things that look and have experiences like that thing that Steve Jobs is showing me on the stage at their product launches. But I also think there was an aspect of it that was back to the risk of not investing. I mean, again, Ginny Rometty looking around at the competition and seeing the competition like passing IBM by and or about to, it didn't take a whole lot of imagination or wisdom at that moment to see that that company was stuck and they needed to start doing some things differently in order to be relevant, or else these disruptive competitors were just going to just
Yeah.
absolutely bury them.
And did the importance of research came later or kind of at the same time or before? Because I heard that like IBM also heavily invested in like user research.
Yeah, that was in the sort of the practice composition of the design program that we built. User
It was
research
together.
was one of the core practices. Yeah, we included
Hmm.
that in the design program. So yeah, it was very integrated.
So design and research essentially were going hand in hand. And would it be typical for the same person to do both or kind of to have more specialized?
Yeah, more specialized. Yeah, we were hiring dedicated researchers and we were building teams that had a cross-disciplinary design team. So a UX designer, a user researcher, a visual or UI designer, a front end developer, you know, those were maybe a service designer, maybe a content designer, plus or minus, that was the kind of the composition of those design teams.
And essentially, they would be then embedded inside of a like a product team with
Hmm.
product manager and engineer,
Yeah.
and designers would be reporting to the head of design, director of design. So essentially, they would be working in an embedded way within the team, but also have the actual reporting to the design leader. Is that
That
correct? Or
was, yes, yes. And then that, because of the complexity of that company, that was happening hundreds of times over. It was a huge company. So
Mhm.
there were all of these different product business areas. And within them, you know, there might be two design teams, there might be 200 design teams. I mean, it was like that much of a distance in scale and complexity. Initially, we didn't have those most senior executive design leaders, those heads of design, VPs of design. We didn't have them out in the business yet. It took
Mhm.
us it took us a while to get those leaders placed in the business. So the original, I mean, it was a prototype for sure. And the
Mm.
early stages of that, it was not fully realized until several years in when we could kind of create that whole teaming and management infrastructure in all of those businesses.
So you are tasked with a big ambitious goal to scale design organization. Where is your mind? Like, where do you start? What are some of the first things that you were doing to kick this off?
Well, my earliest responsibility had to do with those designers that we were hiring. So we mentioned the overall number of designers that we added over my time there was over 3,000 designers. The original hiring projection when we kicked off the program in 2013 was 1,000 designers. We needed to get to 1,000 designers as quickly as possible. We thought it would take about 4 or 5 years. We ended up getting there a little earlier, about 3.5 years. My initial responsibility in the program, alongside a small group of other leaders who were focused in different areas of it. My responsibility was bringing those new designers into the company. Because we were hiring so many, we were hiring early career designers, mostly right out of university or graduate programs.
Because
And
of the economics?
partly because of not really because of the economics, but because of the scale, because it allowed us to recruit. If we were hiring, mid-career designers one at a time, it just didn't scale. We'd have to go out and find individual designers all over the place and do that whole recruitment process one at a time. That doesn't get you to 1,000 very quickly. But if you can go to a bigger university and you can recruit at scale, you can recruit maybe 10 or 12 designers from a single academic program, then you've got something that scales.
How did you ensure or work towards ensuring consistency and like high standards of quality, especially if you're hiring early career designers? They need to be educated, they need to be mentored. What was a way to keep those high standards?
Yeah, I was getting there. You took the words right out of my mouth, because that's the risk when you're hiring early career designers, is that they're many of them were in their first, maybe second professional, career oriented job as a designer. And yeah, what if they just don't have, they might have a great portfolio and they can make things that look nice in a portfolio, but are they really going to be able to deliver in a very complex company and organization with very complex technology and all of that? Is a tall order. So one thing that we did that was very important to that was to create an onboarding bootcamp experience for those designers. And we were hiring designers into the company in cohorts twice a year, once in the summer, once in the winter. We would hire 50, 60, 80 designers at a time, and they would come into the company and into this boot camp together. And we would have them in the early stages of the program. We would have them in that boot camp for 3 months before they then were assigned out to the team that they were going to join in the business. And so that's what those 3 months were about: getting them to understand the technology, getting them to understand the practices that we were building, the human-centered design practices, and the sort of the workflow of design, getting them to understand how to work with each other in that cross-disciplinary design team that I just described to you. When you have a young designer who's come out of a university program, they've never had an experience of collaborating with other designers or other cross-functional stakeholders on a team. They've worked only by themselves. And so that was a big part of what we had to do in that boot camp, was teach them how to collaborate, teach them how to work with each other. So there was a lot of that upskilling. It was kind of the bridge between the academic experience and the professional experience. And what we found also, because they were going through this together, and it was in person. We did it Austin, Texas, in our in the IBM design studio. and it was like a residency. They were in the studio for 3 months with us. They were working on projects from the business, so it was very hands-on, very real world. It wasn't academic, it was very practical. We had it was a very powerful experience, and we had a very high success rate then of those designers going out into the business and being able to contribute right away. As soon as they hit the ground, they were contributing and performing at a way higher level than they ever could have had we not done that boot camp experience.
How long was the boot camp again?
3 months.
3 months. Yeah. And so you had the boot camp and you had frameworks. Like this is where all the standardized like language from IBM comes, like the design thinking framework, HEALS, playback,
sponsor
and
users.
all those things.
You're good. Arseny, you've been doing your IBM design
Well,
homework.
I've went through this, and I also worked with some folks who used to work at IBM. And what you discover when you do is that they very much like to continue to talk about how things are at IBM.
That's funny. There is, and IBM's a big company, and there is a whole other side to the story. We don't need to go deep on it, but just for the context, there is this product side of the business, which is software and hardware and infrastructure. And then there's a whole other side of IBM that is a big consulting business. And so about almost half of those 3,000 designers were working in that consulting side of the business, which is very different. It's managed very differently, as you can imagine, and has a lot of differences in culture and ways of working, but still using the same practices and the same design thinking approaches and so on.
Where were you finding researchers from? Like if you were recruiting designers from university, like where were researchers coming in?
Some of the top university programs were at that time Carnegie Mellon University in Pennsylvania, University of Michigan, SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design. Those were really consistently strong programs that we were recruiting from heavily in those years.
IBM's process is very structured. When you work with other companies, let's say if you were advising a startup, maybe, I don't know, 300 people, 500 people, or 20 people, how applicable is IBM's framework to like smaller organizations? Like, do you find yourself explaining things in the same methodology in the same ways, or do you kind of abbreviate things?
It's a good question. It was definitely the practice that we developed at IBM was developed for IBM. I mean, it was developed for the scale and complexity of that global enterprise. And as we exposed it to and worked with IBM client companies, other companies of that scale, we found that it worked as well or even better in some cases with those other really complex, large scale organizations. The core principles also scale down, but you need to do some calibration to apply it in smaller scale, less mature organizations, startups. Certainly, it's important, I think, with any framework like that, not be overly dogmatic about it, to not be overly rigid about how it's applied, and to be able to step back and to understand what the principles of it are, as opposed to what the details are. In fact, we had to make a pretty fundamental shift in that design thinking practice after a few years, because we found that the teams that were adopting it were being overly detailed about it. They were taking it, if you're familiar with the Stanford D School kind of hexagon, model for design thinking, we adopted
double diamond.
No, it's different than the double diamond, but it's the
hexagons.
a bunch of hexagons. Each one is a different stage in the process,
Okay.
from understanding your user to ideating, prototyping, testing, learning,
Empathize,
etc.
design, build. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So what we found is that that teams at IBM were looking at that and thinking, oh, okay, each one of these boxes is something that I need to do and complete before I can go on to the next one.
Mm.
And so they would get stuck. They would
Hmm.
get stuck on the we can't move on to the prototyping stage because we haven't yet
Discovered.
completed we haven't done the discover stage yet. And of course,
Hmm.
those of us who are in it and know the practice are like, no, 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 you don't get it. You're supposed to be doing all of that basically at the same time. And of course, when you find yourself saying something like that, you don't get it or you don't understand, then you need to probably look at yourself and say, maybe I'm not explaining this well clearly enough. And that's what we did. And that's where, if you're familiar with the current sort of practice of IBM's, they call it enterprise design thinking,
Hmm.
it uses the infinite loop as the metaphor, as the mental model. So you're constantly moving through this loop and you're in constant motion as a team. And we found that that was a much more effective, a much clearer way for us to explain it. And it avoided that inevitable problem that we were having before of teams just getting stuck.
Yeah, this is great. Most designers are into craft. They do like to create, they do like to design. Now, the leadership roles oftentimes assumes, much, it's a whole other set of responsibilities. What is your take on the combination of individual contributor role with design leadership? Is that possible, or do you sort of need to give it up and never do things in a hands-on way once you transition into leadership?
No, I think it's challenging to do that. We're seeing a trend in design leadership toward what's called a player coach. So that combination of being a manager and being an individual contributor with your hands on the work. I don't love that idea. I don't think a designer invented that idea. I think that was invented by some HR person who wanted to save money and get sort of two people in one. And I find that that's not a very sustainable model for a leadership role. It's not that it can't be. It's not that it can't be. Done. It's not that there's only one way to do it, and you need to choose between this or that. But I do find that over time, that role just isn't sustainable. It's just too hard to do both of those things at once. If you've been a manager of designers, you know that that is not a frivolous job. That is a very
Yeah.
challenging job that takes a lot of time and it takes a very dedicated side of your brain to do that. Whereas being an individual contributor is also very demanding. It takes a whole other set of skills that are on the other side of most of our brains. So it's just a very challenging idea. What I do like though is when companies build career frameworks with the flexibility for a designer as they progress through their career, even at those senior levels, to be able to cross back and forth if they so choose. So, for instance, I'm going to take a job as a design director in my company because there's an opportunity there, and I haven't done that before, and I want to do that. I think I'd be good at it. Okay, I've done that for 2 or 3 years, learned a lot, did a lot of good stuff, contributed to the business, and now I want to do something different. I miss having my hands on the work. I want to go over. There's an opportunity to be a principal designer in another part of the business. I want to go do that. A lot of companies will not allow that to happen or will make it very, very difficult to do. I actually find it, I appreciate, and in fact, when I was at Expedia, there was a lot of freedom for designers at those stages to move back and forth between those two career paths. And it was a very positive thing because it extended, in most cases, it extended that the tenure at the company because they had the opportunity to do different things. They didn't get burned out. They didn't have to look to a different company to get a different set of experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the more enlightened, design programs have that ability.
So if an individual contributor designer, like their output, so to speak, is prototypes, designs, things that can be handed off to engineers for implementation, kind of in simple terms, what are the, yeah, go ahead.
I think that's part of it. I think also a strong principal designer is also going to be, they're going to own the craft and quality for that team. They're going to be a mentor. They're going to lead the critique practice for that team. And also, they are going to be publishing and scaling their practices. So they're going to be creating practices and they're going to be making sure that other teams are able to consume and adopt those practices.
So if those are the outputs of an individual contributor, what are the deliverables of a design leader? Like, what are the artifacts or what are the tangible results that they bring?
Their responsibility is the management of the team. So they are leading the growth of the team. They're responsible for the performance of the team, but they're also their orientation needs to be outward from the team. The individual contributor should be spending most of their time with the team. The manager should be spending most of their time outside of the team. I mean, I'm using very generalized terms here, but you get the idea. So their key stakeholders are the their product management and engineering and data science and marketing peers, their upline managers and their stakeholders out in the business. And that is where they need to be spending most of their time, building those relationships, developing discovering shared objectives or opportunities for shared objectives between those teams, and making sure that design is prioritized in the roadmap of the product or portfolio.
One of the things I wanted to talk with you about, and you mentioned it earlier, is the importance of critiques, like the process of providing feedback. And when we spoke off camera some time ago, we talked about how it is becoming a little bit of a lost art. I think that's what the term you used. Can we talk about, first of all, the importance, like why critiques are important, and then maybe we can dive into some of the core principles of what a good design critique is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, critique is how design uh, and designers get better. How we elevate quality um, and uh, and what I find, to your point, is that the practice of and the behaviors of critique are really missing in a lot of teams. And you trace that back. Why would that be? You trace that back to academic design programs. They've become increasingly about learning tools and learning skills as opposed to learning how to discuss design, learning what great design is and how to achieve it. And so there are some roots, I think, and some problems with how design is being taught and learned in the university level, or even in the emergence of boot camps as a way to learn how to be a designer. I mean, those are very fast tracked, very compressed experiences. And, you're not spending a lot of time, if any, really critiquing and as a team looking at a piece of design together and discussing it and analyzing it and criticizing it and identifying what could be better about it. So again, just kind of placing that in context, and so now we see ourselves in these complex design teams, and there's pressure, and everything's needs to happen faster, and it's easy to say, oh, we just don't have time for that now. We can't do it this week because we've got we're in the middle of a sprint, and we're cranking on this other stuff, so it gets deprioritized. And meanwhile, the overall quality of the output of the team is slipping and slipping and slipping. And suddenly, you hit a point where something happens, and you get a piece of feedback from users that is like, we're in trouble now because we took our eye off the ball and we just let the quality slip. And then if you rewind that tape, you're oftentimes finding that team just lost their cadence, lost their rigor, and lost the ability to really get in there together and make their designs better. So we did a lot of work both at Expedia and IBM around reteaching that practice and creating a culture of critique, so that it's not, ultimately you want to get it to a point where it's not a whole separate thing, but it's part of the behavior of the team, that they're constantly in the motion of critique, and they're constantly looking at each other's work, at the collective work of the team, with a critical eye, and able to make it better.
So let's say you have a team who didn't take the workshop on how to do critiques. What are the top 3, whatever amount of guiding principles that you would want to share, like in a few minutes? Like, hey guys, just make sure to do this. Maybe don't do that. What would that be?
Well, I think critique is a group activity, so it's not one-on-one in its best condition. It's not one leader, that principal designer, that lead IC. They might be leading the critique, but in the ideal circumstances, and this is not always how it is practiced, but their voice should not be the only one that's heard in that critique. It's got to be a group, a group discussion. It's got to be constructive. It's not about ripping. It's not about humiliation, and it's not about making a designer feel terrible about the work that they've done. You have to find that balance of being able to deliver feedback that might be negative and it might be critical, but also to do it in a way that empowers that designer to say, I get it. I got this. I'm going to go do better. I'm going to go make this better.
What's the art of delivering the feedback so that the person doesn't feel defensive and rather can use that? In my opinion, it takes both sides, to be at a certain level. When you are receiving feedback, you also need to kind of know how to receive that, and when you're giving it.
Yeah. I think part of the trick is for teams to sort of discuss how they're going to do critique before they do it, to kind of set some code of conduct, to set some expectations, to make sure that everyone understands that, hey, I'm gonna deliver some critical feedback to you. It's not because I think you're a bad human. It's not because I don't like you. It's because there's something about the design work that you've done that I think could be better. And I find that once everyone is sort of understands that basic idea, then it relieves some of that pressure that can oftentimes just lead to some really negative energy around critique. And certainly many designers have, myself included, early in my career and university, have just terrible memories of critiques that were just miserable. But, that's not what it's about. It's about making the work better. And it's about making each of us better through this group collaborative process.
You mentioned that it's better not to do one-on-one. Do you typically invite like cross-disciplinary group or kind of keep it within just the design team?
I think not always. And I should clarify, there are certainly lots of moments where one-on-one critique is absolutely the best way to do something. If a principal designer is working with a designer on their team, yeah, they need to be able to get in there together into the work and just get into it one-on-one. And then there are certain moments where the design team needs to kind of have their environment where they can come together as a design team and have critiques together. And then on occasion and at some other cadence to invite those cross-functional stakeholders into a critique type experience. That can be very, very powerful for them because oftentimes, those engineering leaders, those product leaders, marketers, they just think the designers are just very tactically oriented, just cranking it out, and that there's no rigor and that there's no real sort of established practice. The critique can actually, when you invite them into that environment, can be really revealing and can help them understand, oh, there's a real deep practice here, and there is an attention to detail and craft that I wasn't appreciating until I saw it at this level, until I heard these designers discussing it in a way that I don't usually engage with, and that can be very very positive.
In the last couple of minutes we have, I'm curious to get your take on kind of who is leading the organization, so to speak. There is the notion of sales-led, product-led, design-led organization. Is there a single function that should be leading? And specifically, what do you think of design-led organizations? Like, is that a myth, a reality?
I think it's almost a myth. I don't think there are too many actual examples of truly design-led organizations. I mean, we can look at Airbnb as perhaps the most complete example where the founders and the current CEO are trained designers at their core. And so the whole equation there is different because the design team, the design leaders in that company don't need to be championing design and banging their fists on the table about the value of design because it's already integrated into the company at the DNA, at the core level. So then, to your point, what then? If that's going to be a rare case, and I think it always will be, what's the next best? I think it depends on what type of how the company is organized. I think the next best options here are product or marketing, and that'll be a different answer for different types of companies. If there are certainly many examples of really enlightened product leaders who have design as part of their scope and domain, and that can be a very positive thing. That can be a great environment for design to happen and to thrive. I think where the watch out is, and this happened as part of during my time at Expedia, was when design moves from product over to engineering, and that was not a positive not a positive organization for design to be placed under. And that's where the warning sign is. If you're if you're on the job market and you're looking at different opportunities, one of the first questions you should ask, if it's not clear in the job description, is tell me about the organization. Where does design sit? Who is who is it reporting into, and what's their point of view? Like what is there, and to ask really specific questions about that. And if the answer is, oh yeah, design's reporting into engineering, but oh, they really love design, I would be like asking a lot of questions about that. That's a very concerning answer in my experience.
Yeah, so is the ideal kind of to have product management, engineering, and design at peer level, or is that oftentimes unrealistic as well?
I think it is ideal. Again, I think it's less and less. There are just fewer and fewer examples of that truly happening. I mean, even in companies like where there is a true chief design officer like PayPal right now with Rachel Kobitz, she was my boss at Expedia when we were there together. And she, even though she's a chief design officer, and the scope of her mission there is truly a chief design officer, she's still reporting into a SVP of product.
Mm.
So um, so there is parity there. It's still organizationally, design is sort of under a different function. And that doesn't need to be problematic. In fact, if you are a chief design officer reporting to a CEO, that is a very difficult job, because if you're reporting to a CEO, you are absolutely beholden to them. And it's definitely one of those be careful what you wish for examples.
As we wrap up, you mentioned you have a course, it's design leadership course. Maybe in a few words, who is the course for and where can people find it?
Yeah, it's on the Maven learning platform. You can just search Doug Powell and design leadership at scale on Maven. You'll find it. And it is for senior design managers, program managers, design ops leaders, and design directors in complex organizations. And those, I was talking earlier about those leaders who are at that point where the game has changed for them and the expectations have changed in their role. That's what we're talking about in that course. It's called Design Leadership at Scale Director, and I run it quarterly. It's a 2-week course online, and yeah, I would love to speak to anyone who is interested in that. And you can learn more on Maven. And I also have a one-on-one leadership coaching practice, and I'm happy to talk to any of your listeners about that as well.
How can people find your one-on-one
Reach out
practice?
to me on LinkedIn, DM me on LinkedIn, and that's these days kind of the easiest way to reach me from wherever you are. And I've got a podcast as well. This is a prototype, the Design Leadership Podcast, which is on hiatus right now, but I've got 2 seasons which you can seek out on wherever you get your podcasts.
Awesome. Doug, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and coming on. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Arseny.